probably most of you, because we live here in this beautiful place where we have lots of great tide pools. We do some tide pooling trips through the rec center. I talked to a few of you about that earlier today. We do those in the spring. So if you're interested in those, we have those coming up in, I think the first one might be in April, but the rest of them are in May and June. So watch Facebook. Our activity guide will be coming out soon. They'll be in there. So you can sign up for those. Pre-registration is required for those because we have limited space for those, but those are always fun. You can come down on the beach and see some animals. We also have edible seaweed ones, so you learn what seaweeds are edible on the Oregon coast. So check those out if you want to join me on the beach. So. Tide pools. We love tide pools. This is Seal Rock State Park. If you haven't been there, that's where we do our seaweed classes. And tide pools are pretty magical places. But what do you need to have tide pools? What do we need? We need the tides. Yeah, definitely. We need the tides. So there's Seal Rock again. We've got high tide and low tide. This is a pretty high tide, high tide at Seal Rock. And it's pretty fast. It's always been fascinating to me how the tides, it's all this land is covered up and all these rocks and all these animals are covered up, and then the water moves out and all this land is exposed and you can go walking around and explore. You just got to make sure you're not in the wrong spot when the water comes back. So how does that happen? What causes the tides? Do you know?
Well, the moon phases.
The moon, yeah, the moon, and also to a little extent the sun. So the moon's gravity is actually what affects the tides. You guys are probably familiar with this. And when they line up, when they're aligned like this, we get those big tides. They're called spring tides. We just had our king tides here in the winter when we get those really high tides. But that is when we have an alignment in the sun, the moon. And in the spring, we get some nice low tides. And that's why we have our tide pool trips in the spring, because we get some -2s. It's a really great time to go tide pooling. So we also need rocks to trap the water into pools, and it also gives animals a place to hang on to. A lot of the animals, they need to stick to those rocks. Some of them move, some of them don't. Fish do hang out in the tide pools, but a lot of these animals are invertebrates, so they don't have spines, and they need places to hide, places to stick to. And protected places, so we've got to have rocks, we've got to have tides. And when we're talking about tide pools, we're talking about the intertidal zone, and from that word you probably can infer that's intertidal, so in between the tides. And if you're looking at this picture, you can probably tell where the upper end of the tidal zone is, right? See this nice line right here? So this is the upper end of the intertidal zone. It's where the animals live, are in the intertidal zone. And if this picture was taken on the lowest low tide of the year, this would be the intertidal zone. So you guys probably know that the tides aren't exactly the same every day. Sometimes the low tide might be here. Sometimes it might be here. It changes every day. So when I say it's a -2 and it's a really good day to go tide pooling, that means the tide's, really low. A couple weeks later, it might be a 1 foot tide. So maybe that means it's, up here, and it's not a good day to go tide pooling because half of it's covered up. So if you look at those tide charts, you can look at those numbers. Anything that's negative or 0, those are good days to go tide pooling if it's negative numbers. And you also want to look at, has it been stormy? The waves can affect like storm surge and things like that can affect the tides as well. But when you're looking at the intertidal zone, there's different animals that live in different levels of the intertidal zone too, because if you're up here, you're exposed to the air a lot longer than if you're down here. Because as the water's moving, and I'm up here, and it's going down, I'm out of the water all this time, low tide, and then it comes back in, I'm out of the water, and then I'm finally back in the water again. So the animals that live up here are gonna have different adaptations than maybe the ones down here. And I'm gonna say that word a lot tonight, adaptations. So that is anything that a plant or an animal has to help them survive in their specific environment that they live in. And we'll learn a lot of adaptations tonight. So, so what is it like to live in the intertidal zone? What do you guys think those animals have to deal with out there? What are some challenges to living in the intertidal zone? Current? Yeah, waves. You guys probably all know those waves are powerful and those animals are little. What else?
Humans.
Humans, yep, we can be a problem. What else? My presentations are interactive.
Predators, seagulls and other birds and raccoons.
Predators. Yeah. So waves for sure. Like you said, the animals are small. Some of them are squishy. Some of them have, we'll talk about some different adaptations that they have to help protect them. Did you have another one? No? Temperature change. So if you may have been walking on the beach sometimes and you step in a tide pool and you're like, oh, this isn't bad. This is nice and kind of warm. And then you walk over to the ocean waves and you're like, oh, it's cold. So if you're in a tide pool and it's a nice sunny day, that water can warm up. So you have to be prepared to deal with temperature changes. Also, you have to be able to deal with rapid temperature changes too, because if you're in that nice warm tide pool and it's been a few hours, tide starts to come in and a big wave comes in, all of a sudden you've got a bunch of cold water coming into your tide pool all at once. And so that's a quick temperature change. So that's a big thing to be able to deal with all at once. And anybody who's ever kept an aquarium knows that some animals are very susceptible to temperature changes. So these animals are tough. They can deal with those temperature changes. Drying out. If you're a marine animal and you're used to being in water and then the tide goes out, you got to make sure that you have something that will keep you wet or moist during that time that you're exposed to the air. So we'll talk about some of those today too. And salinity, so the salt levels. So if you're in a tide pool that's not exposed to, it doesn't have waves coming in during low tide, and we get one of our famous downpours, what kind of water is coming into your tide pool?
Yeah.
Fresh water. So that can affect the salt levels in your tide pool. So the salinity can be a problem. Also, a lot of freshwater streams come into the tide pools, so lots of changes and things that they're dealing with all the time. Predators you guys mentioned, and we have to deal with two different kinds of predators, aquatic, land, and you guys mentioned people too. So there's a couple different ways that we can affect the tide pool animals. Of course, there's the big things like pollution, plastics in the water, trash, things like that. But there's also smaller things like the way we're out there interacting. We call that tide pool etiquette, which we'll talk about that a little bit. So how we're walking out there, how we're touching, where we're walking, and harvesting, which harvesting can be done responsibly for sure. There are guidelines for harvesting. There's areas where you can and can't harvest, and those guidelines are online. But Oregon has been really great in creating some marine reserves, marine gardens. So Otter Rock, just north of us, is a marine garden. So you can go out there and explore, but you can't harvest, you can't take anything there. A lot of the marine gardens and marine reserves will have an interpretive ranger out there in the summer, because as you guys know, we get lots of tourists in the summer. Someone from Portland or Eastern Oregon or something may not know how to interact with the tide pools. And so they're out there trying to educate people and let them know, that's actually an animal, don't step on it, things like that. So, which we'll talk about a little bit today too. So we're gonna meet 7 animals, unfortunately not in person. Like I said, I don't have all my cool things from the aquarium, so this is all I got today for visual aids, which you guys can come up and explore when we're done, but I've got lots of pictures. And we'll talk about these different animals and how they survive in the tide pools. So we will talk about how they eat, how they move, or if they move, how they defend themselves. And since we're not in an assembly full of elementary students, we'll talk a little bit about reproduction. So if you're watching at home, we will be using a few anatomically correct words, but nothing graphic. So just had to put the disclaimer out there. Because we have some interesting reproduction methods in some of these animals we're going to talk about today. So I just had to put it in there. So First up is the humble barnacle. I'm sure everybody's seen barnacles, but have you ever really looked at a barnacle? Like, what does a barnacle do? How does it live? Like, oh, they're everywhere. What are barnacles? Whatever. But barnacles are kind of interesting animals, and they are arthropods, which means that they're related to things like crabs. What? Yes. You might think I'm lying to you, saying that is related to a crab, but it is. So arthropods have jointed legs, and these may not look like jointed legs, but those are legs. Now, when I say legs, that doesn't mean that barnacles move, because they don't. Barnacles are actually glued in place by their heads, so they don't move. The adults will secrete a chemical into the water that attracts the larvae. So these guys start out as plankton, they're floating around, and when they get big enough that they're ready to attach to something, they like to form colonies. So they will find where the other ones are, they'll glue themselves down by their heads, and that glue is so strong, so powerful that scientists have been studying it for like dentures, which is kind of interesting. And so they're glued down by their heads. They got their nice little shells to protect them. And while the tide is out, they're all tucked in those little shells. They got this little trapdoor thing here, and this is called their operculum. So that's keeping the water in, it's keeping predators out, it's keeping them all nice and safe there while the tide is out. And when the tide comes in, they open up and they put their little feathery legs out and they filter feed. So if you've ever been to the aquarium and seen the barnacles in there, you can see them doing this. And I found a video. These are some barnacles that washed up on a beach. And you can see those feathery legs coming out and trying to find some food there. But that's how they move those legs out to filter feed the plankton. So if you happen to go to the aquarium, when they put their brine shrimp in there, you can see them doing this and filter feeding. So the ones you're most likely to see in the tide pools here are gooseneck barnacles, which are these guys. They have kind of this pointed top on them. If they get big enough, they'll have like a longer neck on them, which is why they're called gooseneck. They are edible. They're not too bad. I've tried them before, but you can only harvest like 10 of them. And if you can't find the big ones, it's not really worth it because they're like, these ones here are just, little tiny guys. So those are goosenecks. These are acorn barnacles. They're attached to a mussel. If you get a big one on a mussel, if you're harvesting mussels, you can eat these too. When you cook your mussels, you can pop them off and like push them through with a chopstick and eat. It's like an egg white inside. It's actually not bad. So those are acorn barnacles. There are some acorn barnacles that are subtitled that get real big, and you can see those at the aquarium too. But there's lots of different species of barnacles. There's some that grow on whales, some that grow on boats, some wood, rocks, all kinds of stuff. You might also sometimes see these. These are pelagic barnacles. They wash up on shore and they only grow on things that are out at sea. So things like trash or driftwood that's been out there a long time, these will attach to those and grow. So if you find something that's washed up that's got those on it, it's been out at sea for a long time. But once it washes up, obviously they're done for because they'll just dry out. So they eat by filter feeding, they don't move, they defend themselves with the shell, and I didn't talk about reproduction yet. How do you guys think they reproduce? Any ideas?
Throw the egg out and the sperm out and
spawning?
Fertilize in the water and go and drift along until they get that urge to settle.
That's a good guess. So broadcast spawning was basically what you described. So a lot of animals will release eggs and sperm at the same time. It's called broadcast spawning. And you would think for an animal that can't move, broadcast spawning would probably be your best bet. However, barnacles don't do that. They actually will fertilize each other. But if you can't move, how do you do that? So barnacles, relative to body size, have the largest penis of any animal because they reach. That's why they like to be in colonies. So, and they are hermaphrodites because if you settle yourself and you glue yourself down and everybody around you is the same sex as you, then dang it, no reproducing. So that's why they are hermaphrodites. So they'll fertilize their neighbor will fertilize them. And one other interesting thing, if that's not cool enough, the other interesting thing about barnacles is that they will actually hang on to those eggs. They brood their eggs, which I thought was pretty cool. So they keep the fertilized eggs safe inside the shell until they're ready to hatch, and then they release them. A lot of animals, they either will broadcast spawn like you described, or they will, as soon as the eggs are fertilized, they release them into the water. But the barnacles will hang on to them until they're ready to hatch. So I thought that was pretty cool. Question?
Well, you said they're hermaphrodites. Do they change sex, or they
No, so they have
decide
both.
which one to be in their
They
own
have both
sex?
at the same time. So they have both male and female parts, both male and female gonads. So yeah, both at the same time. Some animals can change between male and females, like clownfish. If they end up with like all the males die or something, some of them will change from female to male. But barnacles are both at the same time, so they have both parts. So those are our barnacles. Up next is mussels. Anybody like to eat mussels? I'm not a huge fan, they're okay. We do have lots of mussels here on the coast. They grow in those big groups, and they are kind of higher up in the intertidal zone. So they live where those crashing waves are. These guys are mollusks, so they're related to all different kinds of things like clams, scallops, slugs, snails. Basically, if it's got a shell, mollusks have shells. And that's its main defense, is that shell. It's got that tough shell. And it's got that strong muscle inside. It's called an adductor muscle that keeps that shell closed. The oyster catchers have those beaks that they get in there and they try to snip that muscle so that it can't close its shell anymore, and that's how they eat them. But the shell is its main defense. And the way it sticks to the rocks is it uses these little fibers here. Some people call those the beard. They're actually called byssal threads. And scientists study these too because it's kind of a marvel of engineering. They're strong but flexible, so they study them for like Kevlar because they've had these little animals where the waves are crashing into them, but they are able to hang on to those rocks. And so if you get these in the store in a restaurant, they clean that stuff off. But if you were harvesting them, that's why they're hard to get off the rocks for what, but you'll see those threads. Excuse me. But that's what they use to hang on to the rocks, are those byssal threads. So they don't move. They're just stuck in one spot as well. And I couldn't find a picture of a mussel eating, but this giant clam, which is a tropical species, feeds in a similar way. They're filter feeders, so they will suck water in one opening right here, and then they will push it out in another opening. But they bring the water in, they run it over their gills, and they collect plankton that way, and then they expel the water. So they're filter feeding as well. So, and then for reproduction, what do you guys think? Broadcast spawn. So not very exciting. They release eggs and sperm at the same time, and that's it. So not as exciting as barnacles, but so they're filter feeders. They don't move. They have a shell for defense, and they broadcast spawn for our mussels. Sea stars. Everybody loves sea stars, and I still call them sea stars at the aquarium. They were like, they're not fish. We're calling them sea stars. So I still call them sea stars. A lot of people call them starfish, but these are ochre stars. They're the most common ones in our tide pools. And even though they're called ochre, they do come in purple and orange. And if you've ever touched one, or if you can come up and touch this one later, they have this bumpy, hard skin. So that's kind of their main defense, is their real tough skin. They are also getting pounded by those waves, so they have that tough skin to help defend them. Seagulls actually eat these, which is insane. They swallow them whole. I've seen them do it. It's really like, how? Like, I've seen one with like the whole thing just like half hanging out of its mouth. I'm like, how? Okay. I don't know how it comes out the other end, but yeah, so seagulls will eat these guys. But they don't have don't think they have a whole lot of other predators. So that tough skin is their defense. And if you're really lucky, you might see a sunflower star. Unfortunately, these guys were really hit hard by the sea star wasting disease that we had about 10 years ago. It affected the ochre stars as well, but they've made a pretty good recovery. And they think it was caused by a virus, and basically it just made them melt. It was weird. Like, I remember going out to the tide pools and you'd see them just like hanging there, like, you know. Really, really sad that these guys have not recovered, because they are one of the coolest sea stars, and they get big. Like, they can get this big. They're huge. I remember we had one in our classroom tank. He was about the size of a quarter. We called him Little Dude, and last time I saw Little Dude at the aquarium after I left, he was about this big. And the aquarium stole him from me and put him in one of the bigger tanks, and I'm not sure where it is now. So I think it's in Passages of the Deep. But yeah, these guys can get really big, and they are the fastest sea star in the world. And when I say fast, I mean they are fast. Look at them go! So they're pretty fast. They don't have eyes, but they have eye spots right here on the ends of their arms. All sea stars do. They can sense light and dark, so they don't see like we do, but they can sense light and dark. So yeah, I haven't seen one of these in the tide pools in a really long time, but maybe someday they'll come back, we hope, because they're pretty cool. So obviously these guys move, and how do they move? They use tube feet. And these are little suction cups that they have on the bottom, and they have a really cool system on here. They actually have a hydrovascular system for their tube feet. So they will suck in water with this little pore right here, and they've got kind of like a plumbing system in here that they pump that water through, and they use that for the suction, and they're very, very strong. So that's why we never want to try to pry them off the rocks, because you can actually rip those tube feet off. And they can regrow them, but nobody likes their tube feet getting ripped off, so we don't want to do that. And it's, you know, they got to hang on when those waves come, so they're very strong. And this is what it looks like underneath, so you can see those tube feet moving around. I think this is another sunflower star. They have a lot more than some species. If you come up and look at this one later, you can see the rows here underneath where these ones have. So this is an ochre star, like you would see in our tide pools. So that's the tube feet. And then for food, these guys are predators. They eat mussels, are one of their favorite foods. And if you see them wrapped around something like this, that means they're probably enjoying a meal. And they have a really interesting way of eating. So they will stick onto that mussel with their 2 feet, and they'll start to pry open that shell. They're very strong. They don't have to pry it open very far though, because they're not going to stick their arm in there. They will actually extrude their stomach through their mouth, which is right here in the center, and they stick their stomach inside the mussel shell, and they put their digestive juices in there. They make a nice little mussel milkshake, and then they suck it all back in, which I love telling the kids. I was like, this is like if you take your stomach and you bleh onto the table at lunch, onto your peanut butter sandwich, and you digest it on the table and then suck it all back in. That's how sea stars eat. And the kids would be like, hey! So, but yeah, this is what their stomach looks like. So it's bag-like, and they can take it out through their mouth and stick it in those mussel shells. So pretty cool way of eating. It takes a long time for them to digest something. So you might see them, again, if you go to the aquarium, sometimes you'll see them wrapped around a clamshell or something. They usually feed them clams. And if you go there like 2 days in a row, it might still be wrapped around the same clamshell the next day. It might take them a day or two to digest something. So it's a slow process. So they eat with that bag stomach that they extrude through their mouth. They move with their 2 feet. They have that tough skin for defense. And what do you think about reproduction for these guys?
Broadcast.
Yeah, they're broadcast spawners too. So again, not very exciting. I do have more exciting ones coming up though, I promise.
Also, you chop them up into pieces. Each piece grows the rest of the stuff.
Yeah. So there's a story about fishermen or oyster farmers or somebody that were mad that the sea stars kept eating all their crop, their oysters, and they'd pull them out and they'd chop them in half and throw them back in. But sea stars, they will grow, they will regrow arms. So the radial disc is this part in the center. So if you chopped it here, this part would not grow another sea star, but it would grow back its arm. But if you chop it in half, you'll get 2 sea stars. So any part that still has some of this radial disc in the center will grow another sea star. I actually have a picture of one. I didn't include it in here, but it was a little tiny one that we found somewhere. It was on one of the aquarium windows, and it had like 2.5 arms, and it was alive. It had like, you know, a little bit of its radial disc still. And yeah, it's pretty amazing that it would eventually grow its pieces back. So I don't know where the other half of it was, but that side was probably still growing too, unless something ate it. So yeah. So that's not how you get rid of sea stars.
Make more.
Yeah, just making more. And then we have the sea urchins. How many of you have seen sea urchins out there? So they see a lot of these at Uquina Head and also at Otter Rock. And these guys are echinoderms, which means they're related to sea stars. I didn't mention sea star or echinoderms when I talked about sea stars because there's not a whole lot in that phylum. There's sea stars, sea urchins, sand dollars, and sea cucumbers. So not a whole lot, a couple other things, but those are the main things. So not a whole lot in there. Radial symmetry, tube feet, and spiny skin are the things that characterize those. So these guys have tube feet too, but unlike the sea star, they're over their whole body. So if you come look at this later, and you look really closely, or even like, well, it's too small to really hold it up to the light, but if you look really closely, you can see there's little teeny tiny holes in between these bumps. So the bumps are where the spines attach, and the little teeny tiny holes are where all the tube feet come out. And this is fragile, so just be careful with it. But they have them all over, and they stick to the rocks too. They're also very strong. We used to have a heck of a time trying to get them into the buckets so we could show them to the kids because they would hunker down in the corners of the tank and would not come out, even if we tried luring them with seafood or seaweed. So the top is where waste comes out, and the bottom is where their mouth is. And their mouth looks like this. These are their teeth right here in the center. They have 5 teeth that are self-sharpening. So again, scientists are interested in that. Self-sharpening, that's pretty cool. So they've been studying how these teeth are self-sharpening because they're very hardy teeth. They can actually make holes in the rocks. So if you've gone to Otter Rock, the rock there is fairly soft. They make these nice little sea urchin condos in there. And they, it's a nice little hidey hole, right? Tide goes out, I'm gonna back myself in here, stick my spines out, and it's a good little spot to hide. It's a good little defense there. So they have those spines to help them defend against predators. They got a nice little hole to hide in, and then when the tide comes in, they will come out and look for food. And those are those spines there. One other cool defense they have, I looked and looked for this video and I could not find it. They have these tiny, tiny little pinchers that they use against things like sea stars. They can't pinch us because they're really tiny. But there's this video, and it's old, that's probably why I couldn't find it. We used to show it to the kids at the aquarium, but this sunflower star decides it's gonna try to eat some sea urchins, and it's coming up on this urchin. The urchin flattens all of its spines, and it sends out these little tiny pinchers, and it starts pinching the tube feet on this sea star. And the sea star's kind of like, wait a minute, and it starts pulling back, and it actually pulls off some of the tube feet from this sunflower star. So they can use those little tiny pinchers against some animals, but we never see them because they don't use them against us because we're too big. But if you touch one though, like you can touch these, they don't hurt you unless you smash your hand on it and they stab you. But you can touch them and they, you can feel their spines moving, investigating you, and they call them a sea urchin hug at the aquarium because they'll kind of do this around your finger, like, what is this thing touching me? But yeah, they can move those spines around, yeah, these are the spines. And what do they eat? Anybody know? Seaweed, yeah, they like to eat seaweed. Unfortunately, sometimes they eat so much seaweed, they create what's called a sea urchin barren. So they will eat all the seaweed. And seaweed is really important, like the kelp forests are a very important habitat for a lot of different animals. So in some areas, the sea urchins have become overpopulated because one of their predators has been removed from the food chain, and that is the sea otter. So sea otters, we used to have sea otters here. They were overhunted, and we don't really, I don't know if they were a huge population of urchins after the sea otters were overhunted here because it happened so long ago. So it could have been that the sea urchin population exploded, everything kind of crashed, the sea otter or the sea urchin population went down, and now it's slowly coming back. I'm not really sure, I haven't studied that. Because when you look for sea urchins, there's a lot at Equina Head, there's a lot at Otter Crest, Otter Rock, but I haven't seen a whole lot of them elsewhere. There may be a lot of them like subtidally, I don't know. But otters are really important in keeping that food chain in balance. They're so important that they're actually called a keystone species. So if you think of an arch bridge, that last stone you put in is the keystone. And if you take it out, everything will collapse. And so the sea otters are called the keystone species because they can keep that ecosystem in balance. And so I've just heard recently that the tribes here has gotten a grant or something. They've gotten some money to try to reintroduce the sea otters here along the Oregon coast. So see how that goes. It'll be interesting to see what happens. They did try to reintroduce, I'm not sure if it was the tribe, somebody tried to reintroduce sea otters back in the 70s here. They just kind of disappeared. We don't know what happened to them. It was not successful. So hopefully they have learned a lot since then and it'll be successful this time. So we'll see. But yeah, we did used to have sea otters along our coast. So hopefully we will again soon. You might also see the red sea urchins out there. They're not as common as the purple ones. The purple ones are like baseball size and smaller. These guys are about softball size. They're a little bit bigger, longer spines, and not as common. So, how do they eat? They use those teeth to eat seaweed. How do they move? They use those 2 feet. Defense, they have spines and those little tiny pinchers. And what do you think reproduction? Broadcast spawners. Again, not very exciting. So next we've got sea anemones. These are the giant green sea anemones that we see very common on our coast. Original name, giant green. They're giant green. They get pretty big. And these guys are pretty cool. They're cnidarians, which means they're related to jellies or jellyfish. And they do have stinging cells in these tentacles. Who's touched one of these before? A lot of you guys. So you know that these ones don't sting us. There are some species that can sting humans. A lot of those are tropical. That's where all the scary things live, right? Tropical oceans. But these ones, our skin is too tough for them to sting. However, if you've touched them and they felt sticky, the reason they feel sticky is because they actually have little tiny harpoons that they're sticking into your skin. And when you're pulling away, you're feeling the rope, essentially, that is attached, and you're pulling it away. So that's why they feel sticky. So if you go to the aquarium on a busy summer day, at the end of the day, they most likely won't feel sticky anymore because they'll be out of harpoons, but they regrow them. And they do also rotate their animals out so they don't get over-touched too much. But out in the wild there, you'll feel them be sticky. But that's why they're sticky. A fish, of course, would have a much different experience. They would they would feel that stinger, the little harpoon stinger thing, and they would pull them into their mouth, which is right in the center there. So, do they move? Yeah. They actually can move. They don't really like to once they find a spot that they like, but they can move. So we've got this one here. You can see this is the foot here, and this one's on a window at an aquarium. So they can move, but they're really, really, really slow. And they will find a spot that they like, and they will tend to stay there. At the aquarium, sometimes they would get up on the windows and they move around, but if they're happy, they will tend to stay put. In the wild, they may have to deal with a piece of driftwood came and fell in their tide pool and it's stuck, and now they're, they can't get their food the way they want it, or sand moves in or whatever. So they may have to move in the wild for whatever reasons. So they can, but they are really slow, and they generally don't like to if they don't have to. And again, this is the mouth right here in the center. So once they capture some food with their tentacles, they will pull it into their mouth. And I'll show you what they look like when they're closed up. So if you do want to touch one of these, it's perfectly fine to touch any of the anemones that you can find in our tide pools. They will not harm you. The only place we tell people not to touch is right in their mouth, because nobody likes being poked in the mouth. It is also the other end. So what comes in also goes out the same hole. Give them some space. and it's a delicate area, so don't stick your finger in there. But you can touch the tentacles, you can touch the sides, you can touch the feet, the foot. So that's all okay. And what do they eat? Whatever they can get. So this is a crab that happened to fall into this one. This is actually the stomach. So sometimes they will stick their stomach out and kind of give it a cleaning, I guess. I don't know. Ours at the aquarium, sometimes they would stick their stomachs out. They kind of look like a balloon or a bag. One time I saw a big fish had washed into the tide pool, and there was an anemone on this end of it, and an anemone on this end of it, and then one on the side. We're all trying to eat it. So they will eat dead stuff if it comes their way. They will catch little fish. They will eat pretty much whatever they can get. So if you can't really move, it's not like they can reach out and grab stuff. They'll take whatever they can get. So, and you think, this has got a shell on it, but they'll work on it. So, and it'll take them a while to eat it. Anything they can get. This is what they look like when they're closed up. These ones are hanging off a rock, so they look a little interesting there. Sometimes they will stick all these little pieces of shells all over them, or sometimes little pebbles. So the thing about these guys is when you're walking around out there, you got to keep an eye out, because sometimes, especially the little anemones, sometimes they're really hard to see. And one, they're slippery, and two, you don't want to squish them. So you need to keep an eye out when you're walking around and make sure you're not stepping on them. And also, when they're closed up like this, they're hanging on to their water, waiting for the tide to come back in. So, some people like to poke them, so they squirt water out, but you don't want to do that, because then that's that much less water that they have until the tide comes back in. So you can touch them when they're like this, just like don't poke them so they squirt. And when you touch them when they're closed up like that, they just kind of close up a little tighter, like, well, it's touching me. They will camouflage themselves. One, it's camouflage, and two, it's kind of like their own little sunscreen. So, and here's an example of a whole bunch of them all together. These are smaller ones. These are ones that the sand has kind of come around. So it's not even safe on the sand sometimes. You just got to keep an eye out, because they're everywhere. One interesting other defense, besides obviously they have the tentacles that they can use as a defense, but they have these special ones that they can use as a defense against other anemones. So there are some anemones that like to colonize together, like those ones we just showed, but sometimes they don't want certain anemones around them, so they use these special white ones that they can use against each other, like, back off, this is my space, and they can use those against ones that they don't want next to them. So they have special ones that are not for catching food, but they use them against other anemones. So, reproduction. They're going to get their own slide for reproduction, because they have some cool reproduction. Promise we had some cool reproduction coming up. So, the green anemones, they're boring. They do broadcast spawning, so that's them. But these guys, the ones with the little pink, you've seen them out there, the little small ones with the pink tinged ones, aggregating anemones. They clone themselves, and they do it by splitting like a cell dividing. It's really cool. It takes a while, but I've seen one do it in the tide or the touch pool at the aquarium, and it just like slowly stretches, and it takes like, I don't know, week or so. It's not something you can like see in real time, but it just looks like a cell dividing, and then it turns into two animals. It's really cool. So cloning itself. And then these ones, plumose anemones, they are subtidal, so you won't see them in the tide pools, but they also clone themselves. They will move a little bit and they will leave a piece of themselves behind, and that piece will grow up into another anemone. So another way of cloning themselves. So kind of interesting. So interesting reproduction on those ones. Defense, they use those tentacles. They eat by bringing stuff into their mouth with those tentacles, and they move with their foot if they need to. Crabs, we got two more animals left. So crabs, these are all crabs that I've found in our tide pools here in Oregon. Hermit crabs, one of my favorites. They're so adorable. I love when you walk up to the tide pools and they're all like, ah! And they go in their shells and they like barrel roll down to the bottom of the tide pools. And then they just they all come right back out. They're funny. We have lots of different species of crabs in our tide pools. This is not a complete list. And there's lots of different types of hermit crabs too. Sometimes you can find Dungeness crabs in the tide pools. Not always adults. A lot of times you'll find small ones. This is a Pacific rock crab. They like to bury themselves in the sand. And so a lot of times you'll only see like an outline of them or just like their heads. This is shore crabs. These are higher up. They will be in the little cracks and crevices, and they're funny because they're really shy, and you'll be walking along and you'll see like movement out of the corner of your eye and you'll be like, oh, there you are. I wouldn't have seen you if you didn't move, you know? But they're little, they're about this big. This is a kelp crab. These are a little more rare to see. They can be, we saw a really big one on our last tide pool trip. It was about this big. It was the biggest kelp crab I've ever seen. His shell was about this big. And I think they're called kelp crabs because of their color, although that one's kind of a maroony color, but a lot of times they're kind of an olive green. And you can tell them, it's kind of hard to see in this picture, but they have these really sharp points on their shell right there. And this one is a porcelain crab, so they are little teeny tiny. One claw is bigger than the other, and they like to hide in the mussel beds. So if you're looking at the mussels, you can peek in between the mussels, and sometimes you see one of these guys peeking back at you. So these are arthropods as well. And again, lots of different species of crabs. The hermit crabs are kind of special because they use other animal shells. So they, I couldn't really find a good picture of what they look like without their shell. They kind of look like this weird, something that looks like an alien horror movie thing. They have this like big curved tail looking body part after. So it's curved so they can hold onto the shell, but they will outgrow those shells and they'll need to find another one. So, and sometimes it's fierce competition for those shells. And if you look up hermit crabs on the internet, there's some that live on land, there's some that live in the water. There's some that, I even saw one, I think it was a tropical species, where they all kind of like lined up, different sized crabs, and they like switched shells because they had outgrown, and it was like this cooperative thing. It was pretty cool. But then also like they will fight each other for shells too, like different species do different things. They'll also sometimes use trash. Like there was one where there was one using like a little cap for a shell. And so yeah, but there are tons of different types of hermit crabs around the world. And then they tuck themselves into those shells when they feel threatened. Other defensive things they can do, bury themselves in the sand where they look super adorable, but they're just little eyeballs sticking out. I love when they do that. And then camouflage. So some of them are really good at camouflage. And some of them are really fast. Like I went to Hawaii and I saw these crabs that were just like, oh, there's no way I'm going to catch one of those. And they were tide pool crabs. I don't know what they were, but they were really fast. And then I mentioned the shore crabs hiding in the little crevices, and the porcelain crabs also hiding. So they're also really good at hiding in the little cracks and crevices out there. So for eating, when you think of a crab eating, you probably think of them eating with those claws. And a lot of crabs do that. So they eat a variety of things. This one's eating another crab. These ones I think are crabs that you find on the Galapagos. These are just pictures I found on Canva. I was trying to find a picture of a crab eating, and they were all like crabs on plates, and I was like, no, that's not what I want. So I had to take what I could get. But yeah, they can use their claws to eat, but some crabs are filter feeders. So this is some kind of tropical crab, but you can see it's got these modified legs, mouth parts here that it's using to filter feed. And we've got tons of different types of crabs that live on the Oregon coast. Not all of them are in the tide pools. The aquarium does a crab day every year, and at least when I ran it, we talked about lots of different crab species and highlighted the different ones around the aquarium. So I don't know if they still do that, but there's lots of different cool crab species. There's some that put anemones on their shells to use camouflage. There's one species that's tropical. They put anemones on their claws, and they call them a pom-pom crab, I think, and they look like little cheerleaders because they have these, but they use that as a defense. So, so many different crab species. And then for reproduction, you guys may be familiar with, which one's the male? This one, yes. So you look for these flaps underneath. So the males are always the tall, skinny ones that look kind of like a lighthouse. The female ones are wider. And at least for Dungeness crabs, you can only harvest the males. The female flaps underneath are wider because that's how they carry their eggs. So this was the only, again, I found lots of pictures of chicken eggs and crabs, but this was the only picture of a crab with crab eggs that I could find. So they carry their eggs underneath that flap, and that's why it's wider on the females. And they can have millions of eggs, and they will get the sperm from the male, they will fertilize them, and then release them into the water. And interesting side note, there's a place called Christmas Island in the Indian Ocean. If you want to like go on a fun rabbit hole on YouTube, look up videos of this place because it's really cool. They have a crab migration there because their crabs live in the forest, and they migrate to the ocean to spawn. And so they mate and they release their eggs. And they've had trouble with, there's so many of them, they have to put up these barriers or like little bridges for them to get over the roads because there's just so many of them, and they don't want to like crush them. They actually like the crabs, and they don't want to get them squished in the roads. And then when they hatch and they come back, look at all the little babies.
Oh my God.
So I probably wouldn't think they were so cute if I lived there and they were like in my kitchen and stuff, but yeah, it's pretty neat. So,
Doing it real quick, authoritative crab reproduction minute.
Oh, sure.
So the males, when they're still hard shell, will sense that a female is coming to time for her to shed, and they're hard shells, right? And so the male will capture the females, hold them under their legs until they spawn, and that's the remarkable thing. I mean, the shed, the remarkable thing in itself, how they can pull all of their hard parts and insides and so on out of the back of the shell and be soft and suck in water and so on. But anyway, the males hold the females until she comes out of her shell, hard shell, has a soft shell, when he can use his two reproductive organs, whatever they're called, and insert them into the vagina or whatever it is. And the crab deposit the sperm and then lets her go, and all the crabs, after they molt, then they'll suck in water, get bigger, and then start adding tissue and grow their muscles back. And the guy at the Marine Science Center, a couple of years after it opened, Dale Snow was the first person to film a crabs took to
That's
reproducing.
Cool. Yeah. And some species will actually hang on to the sperm for a while until they're ready to fertilize their own eggs. So, kind of neat. And different animals will do that, like octopuses do that too. they will hang on to the little sperm packet from the males until they're ready to lay their eggs. So, yeah. Question?
So everything that we've seen so far, they release their eggs and then that's it. No maternal, no family unit type
Yep.
situation.
Yep.
Interesting.
It's a tough world out there. Yeah.
For most.
Yep.
So is a soft-shelled crab different than a hard-shelled crab and soft?
It's just one that's recently molted.
But it is.
Yeah. So, all right, we've got one animal left.
Package on the outside, right, hard shell,
Right,
and they can't grow
right.
when they hit that shell,
Yeah.
and so they have to get rid of the hard outside skeleton
But it's
shell.
still the same.
You suck up some water to expand,
Okay.
and then grow back into that.
So when I ate a soft-shell crab in Boston, that was just a
Different,
season
yeah.
or a time.
Yeah.
A time.
Yeah, a whole different deal, blue crab, that's
Yeah,
why
yeah.
the market there, yeah. Yummy.
So our last animal is a nudibranch, and these are all nudibranchs that I have personally found in the tide pools. We have quite a few different species of nudibranchs in Oregon. They are sea slugs, and I was so excited to find this little guy. There's a gift shop down, a new one down on Canyon Way that has a bunch of little nudibranchs. So I was like, yes, I'm doing a talk, so you can come check him out later. But there's two different kind of body forms for nudibranchs. You got these fluffy ones, and then you got the ones that are more smooth bodied. So we have, I've got names on all these ones, and they're mollusks. And so they are related to, again, clams and all those things, even though these guys don't have shells. So they are soft body. Slugs don't have shells either. These are sea slugs. But yeah, these are all ones that I've found here in our tide pools. Most of them are about, this big, this big. These barnacle-eating ones are very small. They're about this big. And this guy here, they're also very tiny. I call them construction workers because they're very orange, but I found out they have a very boring name. They're red Dorids. Anyway. I was very excited to find the clown nudibranchs. These are pretty rare. Sea lemons are pretty common. Opalescents are pretty common. And spotted leopards, sometimes somewhat common, but the rest of these are not as common. These guys are pretty common too. So, but again, they're very small. There are, we'll look at a website with some different ones. So, how do they move? Well, they move like a slug. They have a muscular foot underneath. If you've never held a slug on your hand and let it crawl, I recommend, just make sure you can wash your hand. But it's really cool. You can feel that muscle moving along your hand, and you'll really understand how they move because they have that muscle that propels them along. Same thing with nudibranchs. They have a muscular foot that helps them move. And then they have this interesting anatomy. They kind of look like a cute little bunny. So we've got these things that look like bunny ears are called rhinophores. Rhino nose. So it's not a nose like we would think, but they use these to sense things in the water like food. This cute little one has eyes, but they don't actually have eyes. So they use those to sense things in the water. And then the cute little bunny tail is actually their gills. So that's their external anatomy there. And then what do they eat? It depends on the species. They eat a few different things. Some of them eat algae. That's why this one's all nice and green. This one eats sponges. That's why it's red. It eats, or orange. It eats sponges that are that color, so it's nice to be camouflaged when you're on top of the thing that you're eating. It helps hide. And then this one is really cool. The opalescents and some of the other ones that are like this, they eat sea anemones and some other things like that. But the cool thing about it is that sea anemones have those stinging cells. They eat the sea anemones, and somehow they are able to transfer those stinging cells into these tentacles on their back. So it's like, not only am I going to eat you, I'm going to take your defense and I'm going to use it myself. And they use those stinging cells for themselves for protection. So I'm not sure how they do that exactly, but it's pretty cool. They're also very good at squishing themselves into little cracks and crevices. So it's, the ones that I showed you on that first slide, a lot of them are in the water, so they all look nice and pretty. When you're looking at low tide and they're hiding in the cracks, they kind of look like little snot blobs, especially like the shaggy mouse ones, they look really weird. So these ones, if you're looking for these, look in the cracks, look underneath the rocks. Don't pick up the rocks, but look under like ones that are overhanging. You can look under there and see if you can find them. I always get super excited when I find nudibranchs. They're my favorite thing to find out in the tide pools. And usually sea lemons is what I find, but yeah, they're pretty cool. And then for reproduction for these guys, they are also hermaphrodites, so they have male and female parts at the same time. And they will get up next to each other and they will transfer eggs and sperm through, I can't remember what the part is called, but they have a part that they will transfer them through and they reproduce that way. So another strange one for our last animal. So we have the hermaphrodite reproduction. They move with the foot. They eat a variety of things depending on the species, and same thing for defense. They use camouflage, they may use those stinging cells, and they squish down into the rocks. So just a couple other things. I know we're about out of time if you guys need to leave, but
Are they edible?
no. That is, if you want to use your smartphone to get to that, this is a website that, I'll come back to it here in a second so you guys can scan it if you want. But it goes to this website, and it's got a bunch of different things on, nudibranchs on here that are in Oregon. So you can explore these, and I think you can click on some of these maybe. Yeah, so you can click on these, which will show you the different, gets you a little bit of information about these. So I'll go back here so you guys can scan that if you would like. Kind of a cool little website. And I do have a couple of ID guides. They're actually the same author, 2 different editions, but if you want to come check it out, take a picture of that if you want to buy one of those books. I do not get any funds from that, but it's one of my favorite books that I use. So I brought it in for reference. And we have I have a crab guide from ODFW if you want to check that out as well. And then real quickly, how to visit. Safety, of course, is really important, and not just your safety, but safety for the animals. So you guys have probably heard a million times all those safety things. Don't turn your back to the ocean, know the tides, all of those things. And then, of course, wear good shoes for traction. It can be very slippery out there depending on where you're going. Our tide pool trip that we go to Neptune is one of my favorites because there's a lot of sand that you can walk right up to get to the tide pools. Otter Rock is a little less accessible because we have to walk down a bunch of stairs. It's a little more slippery. So if you're a little more nimble, you can come on that one. But if you're a little less nimble, I would recommend the Neptune trip. And then I'm not sure where we're going to go on our other one yet. To be determined. And it's a good idea to let someone know where you're going if you're going by yourself. Use hiking poles if you need it, but again, be careful where you put them. Make sure you're not squishing anybody. And just be careful on those slippery rocks out there. As far as animal safety, we talked about this a little bit already. Watch where you step. Don't pry animals off the rocks. Touch gently. And if you pick them up, put them back. Obviously, we're not picking up sea stars, but if a little hermit crab or something like that, you pick it up, put it back. And always remember you're a guest in their home. You want to make sure that you're being respectful when you're out there and enjoying it, but also being making sure you're not doing any damage while you're out there. This is also useful if you want to scan that. And I'll just quickly go to this site too. And so this has got a map on it. It's also a little more in depth to that tide pool etiquette I just mentioned. And I'll pop over here and I'll come back to that too if you didn't get a chance to scan it. But this is an Oregon State Parks page, and it's got a tide pooling map, things to do. It's got information about what am I trying to say? Information about ranger programs, things like that. So a lot of good information on this. Species guide, It's got some videos and things on here, so if you need that, there's a scan for it on there. Oregon State Parks has a lot of good resources for tide pools, and in the summer, a lot of times they will have beach rangers down in certain areas as well. Everybody got it? So, any questions? I kind of rushed through the end because we ran out of time. But, and I'll be here for a few minutes too, yes.
So when you broadcast reproduce, how do they know when to do it at the same time?
They're not quite sure. They thought it might have something to do with like moon cycles, time of year, water temperature, all those maybe factors. So yeah, those, and also maybe chemicals in the water, because if one starts, then they'll all start doing it. So, yeah.
What about hermaphrodites? You still need two animals to reproduce?
Yeah,
it can't just be one.
Yeah, they can't self-fertilize. Yeah. Any other questions?
So sometimes it looks like sand washes in and buries the rocks that they're adhered to. They still under there?
I don't think so. They would die. So they either move or they die if they can't. Like, you know, barnacles, obviously they can't move. So they, if you're buried under like feet of, I mean, sometimes it is feet of sand. So they're not going to be able to filter feed if they're under feet of sand. So, and if you look at some of those places, they don't have a lot of barnacles, things that can't move on them. But they'll have things that can. So there's kind of like, when you go to those places, kind of see if you can pay attention to what sort of animals are there. Are they mobile ones, or are they, you know?
It might make a difference how porous sand is. If it's coarse sand with a lot of water and oxygen moving through it, they're probably better able to survive being buried for a while than typically southern sands that are so fine that they'd probably smother. That's why we have such few places with crater times, and up north there are miles and miles and miles of them.
Yeah. Any other questions? All right. Well, thanks for coming. And like I said, I'll be here. So if you have questions, you can come up to. And yeah, hopefully we'll see you at one of our other talks. And yeah, thanks for being here.